Imagine building a roof and then cutting a massive hole in the centre. Not a small skylight. A 9-metre wide opening that lets rain pour directly inside. An opening at the dome's highest point. The exact spot where structural stress is greatest, where every engineering instinct says you need maximum strength, not a void. Yet this hole is why the dome survives. The Pantheon in Rome, completed in 125 AD, a concrete hemisphere 43 metres wide, crowned with an oculus that opens to sky. Engineers spent 12 years building it, and when the wooden supports were finally removed, the dome stood. It's still standing 19 centuries later, the largest unreinforced concrete dome in history. The hole that shouldn't work, works perfectly. How did Roman builders know? Stand beneath the Pantheon today and look up. The oculus frames a circle of sky, blue during day, star-filled at night, grey when storms pass overhead. Rain falls through that opening in vertical shafts of water, hitting the marble floor and draining through bronze grates installed 2,000 years ago that still function perfectly. The floor slopes subtly toward these drains, designed with such precision that puddles never form. But the oculus does more than let in light and weather. It relieves pressure. A solid dome creates compression forces that push outward as much as downward, trying to explode the structure from within. The oculus releases that pressure, allows the dome to breathe, transforms what would be a structural weakness in solid stone into an engineering advantage in concrete. The Romans understood this empirically, through experience building smaller domes, through generations of trial and error. They didn't have mathematical formulas, they had observation, intuition, and the courage to test theories at massive scale. The dome itself defies simple explanation. Concrete that changes composition as it rises, heavy travertine aggregate at the base, lighter volcanic stone in the middle, pumice near the top. Stone that floats in water, incorporated into a roof, making the apex weigh less than the foundation. Weight distributed through geometry, through the curve that transforms downward force into outward thrust contained by walls 6 meters thick. And carved into the dome's interior surface, 140 coffers arranged in 5 concentric rings. These aren't decoration. They're weight reduction. Each rectangular depression removes material without compromising strength, reducing the dome's total mass by 30 to 40%. Less weight means less stress. Less stress means survival. The construction required a wooden framework rising 43 meters inside the rotunda, a temporary hemisphere holding liquid concrete until it cured. For 2 years, the dome rested on wood. Then came the moment of truth, lowering the centering, removing support, discovering whether Roman engineering had achieved the impossible or miscalculated catastrophically. The dome stood. Cracks appeared in the first weeks, hairline fractures as the concrete settled, as weight redistributed, as the structure found equilibrium. Engineers watched those cracks anxiously, but they didn't grow. They stabilized. The dome held. 19 centuries later, it's still holding. Still the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built. Still teaching modern engineers lessons about material science, structural geometry, and the audacity required to build what shouldn't be possible. This is the story of how it rose, how Roman builders mixed stone and water and ambition into something that outlasted their empire, their language, their gods. This is the Pantheon. Let's begin. Welcome back to the Sleepy Structures, where we explore the buildings that shouldn't exist, the monuments that defy common sense, the structures that make modern engineers study ancient techniques, and wonder how civilizations without computers or steel or even accurate mathematics managed to create things we struggle to replicate even now, with all our technology and knowledge and tools that would seem like magic to the builders, who worked with nothing but stone and rope and human muscle, and a stubborn refusal to accept that some things simply cannot be built. Tonight we travel to Rome in the 2nd century AD, to a circular temple that would become the longest surviving testament to Roman engineering genius. A building crowned by a dome so large it wouldn't be matched for 1800 years. A dome with a hole in its centre that opens to sky and rain and stars. A dome that has stood for 19 centuries and continues standing, impossibly, beautifully, permanently. This is the story of the Pantheon, the temple with the impossible roof. Let's begin with the problem, with the challenge, with the question that had no reasonable answer. And so the question arrived like a challenge thrown down before every mason and engineer in Rome. Build a dome twice as large as anything successfully built before. Build it from concrete that wants to collapse under its own weight. Build it with a hole at the top where structure should be strongest, and make it last not just years but centuries, not just centuries but millennia. Make it so perfect that future generations will study it with tools you cannot imagine and discover that your intuition was correct, that your geometry was sound, that your faith in volcanic ash mixed with lime was justified, even though you had no equations to prove it, no computer simulations to confirm it, nothing but the accumulated wisdom of builders who had come before, and the awareness that you were attempting something none of them had dared. The mathematics were unforgiving in their simplicity. Roman domes built successfully up to that point measured perhaps 20 to 25 meters in diameter, sometimes 30 if the builders were brave and the foundations exceptional. Those domes covered bathhouses and temples and civic buildings across the empire, impressive certainly, adequate for their purposes, proof that concrete vaulting worked at reasonable scales. But 43 meters, 43.3 meters to be precise, a number that Hadrian had apparently fixated upon because it matched some geometric relationship he'd discovered, some perfect proportion between diameter and height that would create a hemisphere so pure that a complete sphere would fit exactly within the interior space, kissing the floor at its lowest point and the dome at its highest, mathematical perfection made manifest in stone and air. But domes don't fail linearly, they fail exponentially. Double the diameter and you don't double the stress. You increase it by factors that compound upon themselves, creating forces that grow faster than strength grows, creating loads that accumulate faster than supports can be added, creating a threshold beyond which ambition becomes catastrophe, regardless of how carefully you build, or how precisely you measure, or how fervently you pray to Jupiter and Mars and Minerva, and all the other gods who presumably watched Roman construction projects with either amusement or horror, depending on their divine dispositions. How do you build a dome twice as large as anything successfully built before, when the forces trying to collapse it increase exponentially with size? The question had no answer in 113 AD when Emperor Hadrian decided to rebuild the Pantheon, the temple to all gods that had burned twice already, once in 80 AD and again in 110 AD, almost as if fire itself was suggesting that perhaps this particular location wasn't suitable for monumental architecture. Perhaps the gods preferred their temple somewhere else, somewhere less prone to flames and structural compromise. But Hadrian ignored the fires and the failures and the reasonable voices that surely suggested building something more modest, something proven, something that wouldn't risk becoming Rome's most spectacular ruin if calculations proved inadequate or concrete proved weaker than hoped, or geometry proved insufficient to the task. Hadrian was unusual among Roman emperors. He fancied himself an architect, studied Greek building traditions, understood proportions and ratios, involved himself personally in design decisions rather than simply commissioning builders and walking away. And Hadrian had apparently decided that the new Pantheon would be crowned not with a traditional timber roof or even a modest concrete vault, but with the largest dome ever attempted. A hemisphere so vast it would redefine what Roman engineering could achieve. The symbolism drove the ambition as much as any practical consideration. Pantheon meant all gods, and what better representation of the cosmos, home to all deities, than a perfect sphere, or rather the interior of a perfect sphere, a space that curved equally in all directions, that had no corners where gods might be excluded, that represented through pure geometry the completeness and totality implied by all. The dome would be that sphere's upper half, and the cylindrical rotunda below would contain its lower half, implied mathematically if not constructed physically, creating interior space shaped like the universe itself, or at least like Romans imagined the universe, ordered, geometric, comprehensible through mathematics, even if those mathematics exceeded current understanding. But symbolism doesn't hold up concrete, and geometric perfection doesn't prevent collapse, and Hadrian's architectural ambitions would mean nothing if the dome fell during construction or shortly after, or even centuries later, proving that some achievements remained beyond human capacity, regardless of how sophisticated the civilization or how determined the emperor. The physics were clear even if Romans lacked the vocabulary to express them precisely. Concrete is heavy. Dome shapes create outward thrust at their base, trying to spread supporting walls apart. Larger domes create exponentially larger thrust, and at some scale, some critical diameter, the thrust exceeds what any reasonable wall thickness can resist, and the structure fails, sometimes slowly through spreading and cracking, sometimes catastrophically, in sudden collapse that kills everyone beneath. Roman concrete was itself only a few centuries old as a construction technology, developed through incremental discoveries and fortunate accidents rather than systematic research. Someone had noticed that volcanic ash from the Bay of Naples region, Pozzolana they called it eventually, named for the town of Pozzuoli, reacted with lime in strange and useful ways, creating a cement that hardened even underwater, that gained strength over time rather than simply drying, that bonded to stone aggregate to create a material that could be poured like thick mud and would set into something approaching stone's permanence. This was revolutionary. This concrete that could take any shape, that could span distances stone blocks couldn't span, that could create curved surfaces and vaulted ceilings without the elaborate stone cutting and precise fitting that traditional masonry required. But revolutionary doesn't mean unlimited, and just because concrete could do things stone couldn't do didn't mean it could do everything ambition demanded. There were limits, poorly understood limits, limits discovered through failure as often as through success. And Hadrian was proposing to build right at the edge of those limits, or perhaps beyond them, in territory where no Roman builder had successfully ventured, where the margin between triumph and disaster might be measured in centimetres of wall thickness, or days of concrete curing, or the precision of measurements that determined whether the dome's curve was true or fatally flawed. And then there was the oculus, the hole, the 9-metre diameter void at the dome's apex where conventional wisdom and structural intuition both screamed that you needed maximum strength, maximum thickness, maximum support. What kind of madness proposed removing material from the most stressed point in the entire structure? What kind of calculation suggested that creating a hole where solid concrete should be would somehow improve rather than compromise the dome's integrity? How do you convince masons and engineers and workers and financiers and the Emperor's own advisors that cutting a massive circular opening at the top of an already impossible dome will make it more likely to stand rather than less? The answer, if Hadrian had one beyond geometric intuition and aesthetic preference, involved compression and weight distribution and the way forces flow through curved surfaces, involved the realization that the apex of a hemisphere actually concentrates enormous compression forces inward, forces that would ordinarily require massive thickness to resist, but which, if removed entirely by creating a hole, would simply redirect themselves around the opening, would flow around the void like water around a stone, would find new paths through the structure that might actually be more stable than the original configuration. The oculus would also reduce total weight by removing concrete from the highest point, where every kilogram contributed maximally to the forces trying to collapse the dome, would create a compression ring at the hole's edge that would lock the entire structure together if properly designed, would admit light that would make the interior usable and beautiful rather than dark and oppressive like so many barrel-vaulted Roman spaces that felt more like caves than temples. But all of that was theory in 113 AD when the project began. Theory that would be tested through 12 years of construction, through excavation and foundation laying and wall building and concrete mixing and centering construction and dome pouring, and the terrifying moment when wooden supports would be removed and geometry would either prove sufficient or catastrophically inadequate. 12 years to build something that might stand 12 hours or 12 centuries, no way to know in advance, no way to test without building the actual structure at actual scale, with actual materials under actual loads, in actual conditions that couldn't be simulated or predicted or rehearsed. The site itself offered one final challenge. Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, a relatively flat area near the Tiber River that was convenient and accessible, but also low-lying and marshy, its soil waterlogged and soft, exactly the kind of ground that settlement engineers warn about, exactly the kind of foundation conditions that make supporting 5,000 tons of structure problematic, even when that structure isn't topped by an unprecedented concrete dome. But the location had been chosen, perhaps because previous pantheons had stood there, perhaps because religious tradition demanded temples to all gods occupy this specific sacred ground, perhaps because Hadrian wanted the building visible from certain important vantage points in the city, and challenging soil simply became one more impossibility added to the accumulating list of impossibilities that the project would somehow have to overcome. So they began with surveyors marking the circular footprint, began with workers excavating marshy earth, began with the first of thousands of decisions that would collectively determine whether Hadrian's impossible dome would stand or fall, whether Roman engineering would achieve its greatest triumph or suffer its most spectacular failure, whether the Pantheon would become a testament to human capability or a cautionary tale about ambition exceeding ability, whether future generations would marvel at Roman genius or study Roman ruins and wonder what hubris had convinced them to attempt the impossible, and what miscalculation had ensured they failed. But failure and success both lay years ahead, hidden behind the fog of construction time, and in 113 AD there was only the question, the challenge, the impossible dome that Hadrian demanded and that Rome would somehow have to build, stone by heavy stone, concrete pour by concrete pour, prayer by desperate prayer, until the day came when wooden supports would descend and the dome would either stand on its own or collapse into history's most expensive pile of rubble. And so the excavation began in the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, where the ground was soft and treacherous, where the Tiber River's patient flooding over centuries had deposited layer upon layer of silt and clay and organic matter that compressed underfoot like wet sponge, where digging revealed not the solid bedrock that engineers prayed for, but more softness, more water, more uncertainty that stretched downward into depths that seemed determined to reject anything humans might try to build upon them. The first shovelfuls came up black and glistening, heavy with moisture that had nowhere to drain. And as the workers dug deeper, 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters down into the marshy earth, water began seeping into the excavation from all sides, rising from below, creating pools that had to be bailed constantly just to see the bottom of the pit they were creating. How do you dig 7 meters into ground that wants to be underwater when the water returns as fast as you can remove it, when every bucket hauled to the surface is replaced by groundwater seeping through soil that behaves more like saturated cloth than stable earth? The dewatering became a full-time operation. Dozens of workers operating Archimedes screw pumps, those elegant spiral devices that lifted water through continuous rotation, while others formed bucket chains, passing wooden pails hand to hand up makeshift ramps, creating human conveyor systems that moved water from the excavation floor to drainage channels that directed it away from the site, channels that themselves had to be maintained constantly because marshy ground wanted to reclaim them, wanted to blur the distinction between wet and dry, wanted to remind Romans that they were building in territory that belonged more to water than to land. The sides of the excavation kept collapsing, sudden slumps where saturated soil could no longer support its own weight and slid inward, burying tools, threatening workers, filling hours of digging in seconds of failure. Wooden shoring became necessary. Vertical planks driven into the excavation walls, braced with horizontal timbers, creating temporary wooden walls that held back earth while the pit deepened, adding carpentry work to digging work, adding complexity to what should have been the simple task of making a hole, except that nothing was simple when the ground fought back, when nature made clear its preference that this particular location remain unmarked by monumental architecture. 7.3 meters. That was the depth they needed. The depth calculations suggested would reach soil compacted enough to bear the weight that was coming, the weight that made previous Roman structures seem modest by comparison. 5,000 tons total. The rotunda walls and dome and roof and portico and columns and marble facing and everything else that would accumulate over the next 12 years. All of it pressing downward through whatever foundation they built. All of it depending on marshy Campus Martius soil, not to compress too much, not to settle unevenly, not to shift or subside or betray the trust that engineers were placing in Earth that seemed fundamentally untrustworthy. How do you convince yourself to build something heavier than 1,000 elephants on ground that feels soft underfoot, even after you've dug 7 meters down? The question haunted the master builder's sleep, but sleep was luxury, and the excavation continued. Workers descending into the pit each morning, spending days in mud and groundwater, and the peculiar gloom of holes deep enough that sunlight only reached the bottom for brief hours around noon, spending days knowing that at any moment the shoring might fail and tons of wet earth might bury them in graves they dug for themselves while trying to build foundations for someone else's architectural ambition. when they finally reached depth, 7.3 meters below the Campus Martius surface, 7.3 meters of excavation that had consumed months, and an unknowable number of workers rotating through the misery of waterlogged digging. The concrete work could begin, and concrete was Rome's answer to almost every construction problem. Concrete that could be mixed on site and poured into forms and would harden into something that wasn't quite stone but was close enough, strong enough, permanent enough for civilizations that thought in centuries rather than decades. The foundation concrete would be the heaviest, the densest, the most robust material in the entire Pantheon. Aggregate of travertine limestone chunks and broken brick and pieces of basalt, all mixed with lime mortar and that miraculous pozzolana volcanic ash that somehow transformed ordinary cement into something that could harden underwater, that could cure even in the saturated conditions of the Campus Martius excavation, that would bond and strengthen over months and years until the foundation became a single monolithic ring of artificial stone 4.5 meters thick and extending 2 meters beyond where the rotunda walls would eventually stand. The mixing happened above ground in enormous quantities, lime arriving in wagons from kilns where limestone had been burned at temperatures that turned rock into powder, pozzolana arriving in different wagons from quarries near the Bay of Naples where volcanic deposits waited to be mined, aggregates arriving from yet more sources, everything converging on the Pantheon site where mixing crews combined the ingredients with water in proportions learned through generations of trial and error, creating paste thick enough that it wouldn't simply flow but had to be shoveled, had to be carried in baskets, had to be transported to the excavation edge and lowered by rope to workers standing in the pit, who would spread it and tamp it and compact it to remove air voids that would weaken the final product. They couldn't pour 7 meters of depth all at once. Concrete generates heat as it cures, and too much concrete curing simultaneously would create temperatures high enough to crack the material from internal thermal stress, would create a foundation fractured before it ever bore weight. So they poured in lifts, horizontal layers perhaps 1 meter thick, and waited between lifts for initial curing, for the chemical reactions between lime and pozzolana and water to proceed far enough that the next layer could be added without crushing what lay beneath, without creating joints so weak that the foundation would essentially be a stack of separate layers rather than a unified mass. The waiting was agony. Days stretching to weeks while concrete hardened at rates determined by temperature and humidity and the mysterious chemistry of pozzolana that Romans understood empirically but not theoretically, that they knew worked but couldn't explain why, that they trusted because centuries of experience had proven it reliable, even though the mechanisms remained invisible and inexplicable. Workers stood idle, costs accumulated. Hadrian presumably asked when construction would resume, and the master builder could only answer that concrete doesn't care about imperial impatience, that chemistry proceeds at its own pace, that rushing would create weakness that might not reveal itself for years or decades, until the full weight of the completed Pantheon pressed down and discovered that the foundation wasn't adequate and the entire structure settled catastrophically, or cracked progressively, or simply tilted like so many ambitious buildings built on inadequate foundations, their ruins testifying to the importance of patience at the beginning, even when every instinct screams to hurry. Layer by layer the foundation grew. 1 meter of concrete cured, another meter poured on top, the excavation filling slowly with material that started as paste and was becoming stone, that would eventually bear the entire weight of Rome's most ambitious architectural project, that would remain buried and invisible forever after, never inspected again, never verified, simply trusted to perform as designed because there was no alternative, because buildings can't be unbuilt to check foundations, because construction demands faith that the invisible parts were done correctly, because the visible parts depend absolutely on that correctness. 6 months, perhaps longer, perhaps a full year. Records from the period don't provide construction schedules with the precision modern minds crave. But eventually the foundation stood complete, its top surface level with the Campus Martius ground surface, a massive concrete ring roughly 47 meters in outer diameter, 4.5 meters thick, 7.3 meters deep, extending 2 meters beyond where rotunda walls would rise, spreading the building's weight across an area large enough that even soft marshy soil might bear it without excessive settlement, might compress evenly rather than unevenly, might prove adequate to the impossible task being asked of it. And then more waiting, months of curing while the foundation gained its full strength, while the concrete continued its slow transformation from paste to pseudo-stone, while water evaporated and chemical bonds formed and the material contracted slightly as it dried, creating hairline cracks that were normal and expected and acceptable as long as they remained hairline, as long as they didn't propagate into structural fractures, as long as the foundation remained fundamentally sound, even if not perfectly pristine. How do you sleep knowing that 5,000 tons will soon press down on concrete, you mixed by hand in quantities beyond counting, and poured into a hole you can never inspect again once it's buried? The master builder didn't sleep well, probably, but construction continued because construction always continues once it begins. Because stopping means failure, and failure means disgrace, and disgrace means your name, if recorded at all, will be associated with Rome's most expensive mistake rather than its greatest triumph, and that prospect focuses the mind wonderfully on details and curing times and the importance of waiting, even when waiting feels like cowardice but is actually wisdom, is actually the courage to trust process over impatience, to trust chemistry over schedule pressure, to trust that concrete becomes stronger with time if given the time it needs. By late 114 AD, perhaps the dates are estimates based on construction logic rather than historical records. The foundation was ready, was cured, was as strong as Roman concrete would ever become, was prepared to receive the rotunda walls that would rise from it like a circular fortress, was prepared to begin its eternal service as the invisible foundation upon which visible glory would rest, the buried ring that would make possible the impossible dome, the patient concrete that would outlast the empire that mixed it, and would still be performing its duty 2,000 years later, when Romans were legend and their concrete was mystery, and the Pantheon stood as the longest surviving proof that sometimes, impossibly, foundations built in marshland on faith and volcanic ash, and the patience to wait for chemistry can bear weight beyond imagination, and can hold that weight not just for years but for millennia. And so the walls began their slow climb upward from the foundation ring, circular and massive and strangely hollow, rising course by course like a stone tide that would eventually crest 22 meters above the marshy ground, creating the rotunda that would someday support the impossible dome but which first had to prove itself capable of standing, of remaining perfectly circular, of resisting its own weight's tendency to spread outward and collapse inward, and generally behave in ways that would make the dome's eventual addition catastrophic rather than triumphant. The first courses went down almost ceremoniously. Carefully selected limestone blocks and bricks laid in mortar, creating the visible beginnings of what would become the Pantheon's defining feature, its circular footprint that measured 43.3 meters in interior diameter, with walls that started 6.3 meters thick at the base. Walls thick enough that you could build rooms inside them, which is exactly what the Romans did, creating a structure that was simultaneously wall and building, simultaneously support and space, simultaneously solid and hollow in ways that made the rotunda architecturally ambiguous, structurally complex and absolutely essential to the dome's survival. How do you build circular walls that must remain perfectly round for 22 meters of vertical height, when even slight deviation from true circle will create stress concentrations that could crack the dome centuries later? The surveyors worked constantly, checking measurements, verifying that each course maintained the precise radius, that the circle wasn't becoming oval or irregular, or developing flat spots where bricklayers had worked carelessly, or where settling had already begun, pulling the structure out of perfect geometry. String lines radiating from the center point, wooden templates curved to match the intended circumference, plumb bobs verifying verticality, all the tools of Roman surveying deployed continuously because the margin for error was measured in centimeters across a circumference of 136 meters, and centimeters of error compounded over 22 meters of height could become meters of error that would make the dome impossible to build, or impossible to stabilize, or simply impossible, period. The wall construction itself was Roman engineering at its most sophisticated. The exterior face was opus testaceum, the brick-facing technique that created beautiful patterns of thin brick set in mortar, creating a surface that was simultaneously structural and decorative, simultaneously formwork for concrete and the permanent outer skin of the building. Bricklayers worked on wooden scaffolding that rose alongside the walls, setting each brick with the precision that comes from generations of craft knowledge, creating courses that spiraled upward around the rotunda's circumference, never stopping, never creating vertical joints that become weak points, always staggering the brick positions so that each brick rested on 2 bricks below, so that loads distributed themselves through the entire wall rather than concentrating along failure lines. Behind the brick facing, the wall was concrete, the same miraculous combination of lime and pozzolana and aggregate that had created the foundation, but here mixed with tufa, volcanic stone lighter than the travertine used below, porous enough to reduce weight while maintaining adequate strength, abundant enough around Rome that supply was never the limiting factor. The concrete was poured in horizontal lifts behind the rising brick facing, the facing essentially becoming permanent formwork that contained the wet concrete until it cured, creating a composite wall where brick and concrete acted together, where the brick carried some load and provided lateral support and prevented the concrete from cracking outward, while the concrete core provided the mass and strength necessary to support what was coming. But the walls weren't solid. Hidden within their 6-meter thickness were chambers and voids and passageways, spaces carved out deliberately to reduce weight without sacrificing essential strength, creating a wall that was more architecture than most buildings managed to achieve, creating interior spaces that served as storage and circulation, and structural relief all simultaneously, and punctuating the wall at 8 points around the circumference were the great alcoves, the exedrae, massive recesses that cut deep into the wall thickness, alternating between rectangular and semicircular shapes, creating the rhythm that anyone standing inside the completed Pantheon would immediately perceive, creating the pattern that reduced the rotunda's mass by removing concrete where it wasn't critically needed, creating openings that would eventually hold altars and statues but which first had to not cause structural failure, Cutting these alcoves was perhaps the most terrifying part of wall construction, because you were deliberately weakening the structure, deliberately removing material, deliberately creating openings that interrupted the continuous circular wall that physics preferred, that would have been structurally ideal, that would have made the dome's eventual support much simpler, except that solid circular walls 22 meters tall and 6 meters thick would have created interior space that felt oppressive and tomb-like, would have wasted material that cost fortunes, would have added weight to foundations already stressed by carrying more than any reasonable marshy ground should be asked to bear. So the alcoves were cut as the walls rose, not carved after completion, but built as openings from the beginning, with massive brick arches spanning above them, with extra brick courses creating relieving arches that redirected loads around the openings, with the piers between alcoves bearing most of the actual weight, creating a structure where 8 massive pillars did the real work while the wall sections between them were almost decorative, almost optional, present mainly to connect the load-bearing piers into a continuous circle that would eventually resist the dome's outward thrust. How do you trust brick arches spanning 6 meters to carry the weight of walls above them, plus eventually the weight of a concrete dome pressing down from 22 meters overhead? The arches were overbuilt, probably, made thicker than strictly necessary, given more rise than minimum structural requirements demanded, designed with the conservatism that comes from knowing that failure would be spectacular and fatal, and would ensure that your name, if anyone bothered recording it, would be associated with the Pantheon's collapse rather than its triumph, and that prospect concentrated engineering attention wonderfully on arch geometry and brick bonding, and the importance of letting the mortar cure fully before adding the next course, because rushed work kills when loads are measured in thousands of tons. The main entrance was itself an alcove, but larger, grander, fitted with a door frame that had been cast in bronze, 12 meters tall, the largest bronze doors in the Roman world, each door leaf weighing tons, swinging on bronze hinges that were themselves engineering marvels, opening into the rotunda to admit worshippers and pilgrims and anyone who wanted to stand in the presence of all gods simultaneously, which was the Pantheon's purpose, its reason for existing, its justification for all this effort and expense and structural risk. The door frame had to be set during wall construction, incorporated into the masonry as the walls rose around it, creating a moment when carpentry and masonry, and bronze working and structural engineering all had to coordinate perfectly, because you couldn't go back and adjust a bronze frame after tons of brick and concrete had been built above it, couldn't fix mistakes after the fact, could only pray that measurements were correct and that the frame was level and that centuries from now, those bronze doors would still swing true on their hinges rather than binding against frames that had shifted as foundations settled and walls spread and all the small movements that buildings make over time accumulated into visible distortion. The scaffolding that made wall construction possible was itself a construction project. Wooden towers rising alongside the rotunda's exterior, platforms at every level where bricklayers could work, where concrete could be mixed and baskets could be stationed, where foremen could supervise and workers could rest between carrying loads, up ramps that grew steeper as the walls climbed higher. The timber required was substantial, oak and pine in quantities that required forests to supply, that required carpentry crews working continuously just to keep pace with the masonry crews who were consuming scaffolding as fast as it could be built, extending it upward as walls rose, creating the paradox where the temporary structure supporting construction was nearly as complex as the permanent structure being constructed. 22 meters, Course by course, lift by lift, week after week, season after season, the walls climbed. Workers who had started at ground level now worked at heights, where falling meant death, where wind complicated every movement, where rain made brick handling dangerous and concrete mixing problematic, where summer heat baked the mortar too fast and winter cold slowed, curing to glacial pace, where every day presented conditions that textbooks would later describe as suboptimal, but which Roman workers simply endured because stopping meant unemployment, and unemployment meant hunger, and hunger meant you'd endure quite a lot of suboptimal conditions rather than face the alternative. And finally, sometime around 117 AD, 3 years into construction perhaps, though the timeline is conjecture, the walls topped out at spring line, the elevation where walls would end and dome would begin, the critical junction where everything built so far would either prove adequate or reveal itself catastrophically insufficient when the dome's weight was added. The top surface had to be perfectly level, had to be perfectly circular, had to be prepared to receive the dome's thrust evenly around the entire circumference, because any irregularity would concentrate stress, would create the crack that would propagate, would initiate the failure that would bring the whole impossible structure down. Surveyors checked and rechecked, measuring across diameters, verifying that opposite points were precisely 43.3 meters apart, confirming that the circle was true, that the walls were vertical, that everything geometric was correct within the tolerances that Roman tools could measure, knowing that tolerances they couldn't measure might still exist, might still doom the project, but accepting that at some point you had to trust your work and move forward, because perfection was impossible and adequate had to be sufficient, and the only way to discover whether adequate was truly sufficient was to continue building and see what happened when loads accumulated and stresses developed, and time revealed whether Roman engineering was genius or hubris. The walls stood ready, hollow fortresses holding themselves up through brick and concrete and volcanic ash, waiting to receive the dome that would test them more severely than anything they'd yet experienced, waiting to discover whether circular geometry and thick walls and faith in materials would prove enough, waiting for the next phase of construction that would either validate everything built so far or reveal it all as prelude to spectacular failure. And so the impossible required the impossible. Walls standing ready to receive a dome that would crush them if built from ordinary stone, that would collapse under its own weight if constructed from traditional materials, that needed to somehow become lighter as it climbed higher, needed to defy the fundamental nature of what stone had always been. Heavy, earthbound, dense, pulling downward with patient, relentless gravity that never tired and never forgave miscalculation, and would eventually win every argument between human ambition and physical law, unless humans could somehow convince stone itself to change, to transform, to become something it had never been before. The answer lay in concrete, but not the concrete that had built the foundation or the walls. This would be concrete that changed its nature with elevation, that became progressively lighter as it approached the heavens, that somehow weighed less at the top than at the bottom, while maintaining enough strength to not simply crumble under compression, creating a dome that would be simultaneously massive and delicate, heavy and light, strong and fragile in ways that seemed contradictory until you understood the chemistry that Romans had discovered almost accidentally and had perfected through generations of trial and error without ever quite understanding why it worked, only that it did. Roman concrete, opus cementicium in the technical language that survives in fragments of ancient texts, was itself a kind of miracle, a material that could be mixed wet and poured into forms, and would harden into something that approximated stone's permanence without requiring stone's laborious cutting and fitting and positioning. 3 ingredients combined in proportions learned through centuries of experimentation: lime that served as the binder, pozzolana that served as the catalyst, and aggregate that served as the bulk material, the filler, the substance that would determine whether the finished concrete was heavy as rock or light as, well, not light exactly, but lighter, relatively lighter, sufficiently lighter that the difference might mean the margin between dome that stands and dome that collapses. The lime came from kilns where limestone was burned at temperatures approaching 900 degrees until the rock decomposed into powder, calcium oxide that would react violently when mixed with water, generating heat and transforming into calcium hydroxide paste that could bond to other materials, that could serve as the glue holding everything together. The kilns burned constantly throughout the construction period, consuming forests worth of firewood, creating smoke visible across Rome, producing the tons of lime powder that arrived daily at the Pantheon site in wagons that added to the traffic and chaos and constant activity that major construction projects generate, that made the Campus Martius a place of noise and motion, and the peculiar organized disorder that skilled labor creates when working toward deadlines measured in years rather than weeks. But lime alone made weak concrete, created material that would crumble and erode and fail within years rather than lasting centuries. The transformation came from pozzolana, that miraculous volcanic ash mined from deposits near the Bay of Naples, grey powder that seemed ordinary until mixed with lime and water, when chemical reactions began that nobody in the Roman world understood. Reactions between silica and alumina in the volcanic ash and calcium hydroxide in the lime slurry, creating compounds that would harden even underwater, that gained strength over time rather than simply drying, that created bonds approaching the strength of natural stone through chemistry that wouldn't be properly explained for another 18 centuries. How do you convince stone to become liquid then solid again, but lighter at the top than the bottom, within the same structure? The answer wasn't in the lime or the pozzolana. Those remained constant throughout the dome. But in the aggregate, the chunks of rock mixed into the cement paste, the material that constituted perhaps 60 or 70% of the concrete's volume, and therefore determined its final weight almost entirely. Change the aggregate, and you change the concrete's density, changed its weight per cubic meter, changed how much mass would accumulate as the dome rose, changed whether the structure's own weight would crush it, or whether it might, impossibly, hold. At the dome's base, where stress would be greatest and strength most critical, they would use heavy aggregate, travertine limestone quarried from deposits near Tivoli, dense rock that weighed nearly 1,900 kilograms per cubic meter, creating concrete that approached natural stone's weight, but which could still be poured and shaped and formed into the curved surface that the dome required. Broken bricks and basalt pieces would supplement the travertine, creating a mixture that was heavy but workable, dense but castable, strong enough to bear the compression that would accumulate as the dome rose above it, as upper layers pressed down on lower layers, as the entire weight of the structure converged toward the base where wall and dome met, at the spring line. But as the dome climbed, as each horizontal lift was poured and cured and became the platform for the next lift, the aggregate would change, would lighten, would transform from travertine to tufa, that softer volcanic stone full of tiny air pockets that formed when lava cooled quickly, stone that weighed perhaps 1,600 kilograms per cubic meter, nearly 20% lighter than travertine while still providing adequate strength for the middle sections of the dome where stress was lower than at the base, where the geometry of the hemisphere meant that forces distributed themselves more favourably, where lighter concrete could function adequately without compromising the structure's integrity. And at the top, near the oculus, where the dome would curve steeply, and where every kilogram of weight contributed maximally to the forces trying to collapse the structure, they would use pumice, volcanic foam essentially, rock so full of air bubbles that pieces floated on water, stone that weighed barely 1,350 kilograms per cubic metre, nearly 30% lighter than the base concrete, creating a dome that literally became less dense as it climbed, that defied intuition, that seemed almost impossible except that physics didn't care about intuition and actually preferred this arrangement, actually worked better when weight decreased with height, when the most stressed parts of the structure carried the least mass, when human ingenuity aligned with physical law rather than fighting against it. The mixing happened in workshops adjacent to the construction site. Enormous quantities of materials measured out by workers who learned the correct proportions through apprenticeship rather than written formulas, who knew by eye and experience how much lime to add to pozzolana, how much water to add to the dry mixture, how much aggregate to fold into the wet paste, creating batches with consistency thick enough that it wouldn't simply flow like liquid, but had to be shoveled, had to be lifted in baskets, had to be carried by workers up ramps and scaffolding and wooden stairs to wherever the current lift was being poured, wherever concrete was needed to extend the dome another 50 or 80 centimetres upward toward the oculus that remained months of work ahead, always waiting. The working time was limited. Once water contacted lime and pozzolana, chemical reactions began that couldn't be stopped or reversed, that would eventually cause the concrete to stiffen and harden, whether it was in position or still sitting in mixing baskets, creating urgency, creating the need for continuous flow from mixing area to placement location, creating work rhythms where crews coordinated like clockwork even though clocks didn't exist, where intuition and experience substituted for written schedules, where everyone simply knew that concrete mix now needed to be placed within hours, or it would be ruined, wasted, useless except as rubble. Quality control happened through observation and experience. Master builders checking the consistency, ensuring that mixtures weren't too wet, which would make them weak, or too dry, which would make them difficult to compact and full of voids, ensuring that aggregate was clean rather than contaminated with dirt or clay, ensuring that proportions remained consistent, because variations in concrete strength within the dome could create weak spots, could create the crack that would initiate failure months or years later when the centering was removed and the dome had to support itself or collapse, had to prove that mixing by eye and experience could produce results as reliable as modern engineering with its precise measurements and laboratory testing and quality control protocols that Romans couldn't have imagined and didn't need, because their empirical methods worked, demonstrably worked, created concrete that'd still be bearing loads 2,000 years later, long after the civilization that mixed it had vanished into history. What if the transition between heavy concrete and light concrete creates a weak boundary where the entire dome fractures and peels apart in layers like an onion? The question haunted the master builder probably, but the mixing continued because stopping meant failure. And failure meant the Pantheon remained an incomplete ruin, and incomplete ruins didn't honour emperors or gods or the workers whose labour was creating something that might, just might, outlast everything they knew, everyone they loved, every building they'd ever seen, becoming one of those rare structures that transcends its own time and becomes simply permanent, simply present, simply there in a way that feels almost natural, as if the Pantheon had always existed and would always continue existing regardless of what empires rose and fell around it. The scale of the operation was staggering. Thousands of cubic meters of concrete would eventually form the dome, requiring tens of thousands of individual mixing batches, hundreds of thousands of basket loads carried by workers whose names nobody recorded, whose contribution was invisible in the final structure, whose labour was simply assumed and forgotten, except that without them the Pantheon remains imaginary, remains Hadrian's dream rather than Rome's reality, remains architectural ambition rather than architectural achievement. And so the concrete accumulated, lime from kilns, pozzolana from volcanic deposits, aggregate from quarries that changed as the dome rose, all converging on the Pantheon site where mixing crews created paste, and workers carried it upward, and masons spread it, and tamped it, and shaped it into the curve that mathematics demanded, and geometry promised would hold, if only the concrete was strong enough, and light enough, and well enough bonded between successive lifts that it would act as unified structure rather than as a stack of separate layers waiting to delaminate under stress. But concrete mixing and aggregate selection were merely preparation. The real challenge waited ahead. The challenge of building the wooden centering that would hold wet concrete in a perfect hemisphere until it cured. The temporary structure that would make the permanent structure possible, the wooden dome that would enable the concrete dome, the ghost that would haunt the construction site for years before finally descending into history and leaving behind the impossible roof that would crown Rome's most ambitious temple. And so they began building a second dome inside the stone rotunda, this one made entirely of timber, a wooden ghost that would hold the shape of the impossible until concrete could harden into permanence, a temporary structure that would bear thousands of tons of wet material, pressing down with patient crushing force, a framework that had to be perfect because any deviation from true hemisphere would be replicated in the concrete above it. Any weakness would reveal itself catastrophically when the loads accumulated. Any miscalculation would mean watching years of work collapse in moments and probably taking several workers' lives with it, into the rubble, because construction failures don't announce themselves politely, don't provide warnings, simply happen with the sudden finality of physics asserting itself over ambition. The timber came from forests across Italy and beyond, oak primarily for its strength and density, pine for lighter structural elements, all of it transported to Rome by river raft or ox cart, arriving as logs that had to be shaped by sawyers working in pits where one man stood above the log and another below, operating long two-handled saws that cut with agonizing slowness through wood that resisted every stroke, creating planks and beams that would become the skeleton upon which Rome's greatest dome would temporarily rest. How do you build a perfect wooden hemisphere 43 meters across inside a circular building when one mistake in the curve means the concrete dome won't fit? When workers are constructing the framework blind, unable to see the whole structure because they're building it from inside, unable to verify its shape until it's complete, and by then it's too late to fix errors that might doom the entire project. The work began on the rotunda floor with the construction of a massive timber platform, layer upon layer of beams crisscrossed and fitted together, creating a wooden foundation that would support the entire centering structure, that would distribute the combined weight of timber framework plus wet concrete across the entire floor area, rather than concentrating it on any single point. That would become the solid base from which the wooden dome would rise like a three-dimensional mathematical equation made manifest in oak and pine and the sweat of carpenters whose skills were being tested at scales that exceeded anything their training had prepared them for. The primary structure consisted of radial ribs, 28 major timber ribs extending from the center point like spokes of an enormous wheel, each rib carefully shaped to follow the exact curve of a hemisphere, each one constructed from multiple timber pieces scarfed together, overlapping joins where wood mated with wood in patterns that distributed stress, that created joints stronger than the wood itself, that transformed separate pieces into continuous structural members that could span from floor to apex without the weakness that simple butt joints would introduce. The ribs rose from the platform and curved inward, following paths calculated to create a surface that was perfectly hemispherical, that would match the geometry the dome required, that would provide the three-dimensional formwork upon which concrete could be placed, and would hold its shape until chemistry transformed wet paste into solid structure. Connecting the radial ribs were horizontal ring beams at various elevations, circular bands of timber that wrapped around the structure's circumference, tying all 28 ribs together into a unified framework, preventing individual ribs from twisting or shifting, creating a geodesic-like structure where every element supported every other element, where loads distributed themselves through the entire assembly rather than concentrating dangerously in any single component. The joinery here was critical. Mortise and tenon connections where one timber fitted into another, secured with wooden pegs that swelled when they absorbed moisture and locked joints tighter than iron pins could achieve, creating connections that would hold under loads that would test them to destruction if the concrete proved heavier than calculations predicted, or if curing took longer than expected, or if anything at all went wrong during the months that the centering would bear weight, that would make the timber groan and creak and compress slightly under forces that wood was never meant to bear, but had no choice except to bear because human ambition had placed it in this position. Between the major ribs, secondary framing filled the gaps, smaller timbers creating a denser network, supporting the wooden planking that would form the actual surface upon which concrete would rest, creating the smooth, continuous hemisphere that the dome required, because concrete poured onto an irregular surface would become an irregular dome, and irregular domes concentrate stress unpredictably, and unpredictable stress concentrations lead to cracks, and cracks lead to failure, and failure leads to ruins, and ruins lead to your name being associated with catastrophe rather than triumph, if anyone bothers recording your name at all. The planking itself, thin boards perhaps 2 or 3 centimeters thick, covered the entire framework, each board carefully fitted to its neighbor, creating a wooden shell that followed the hemispherical curve that would contain the wet concrete and prevent it from sagging or slumping or flowing downhill toward the base, that would hold everything in position until the Pozzolana reactions proceeded far enough that the concrete could support itself. The boards were probably wetted before concrete placement, deliberately soaked so they would swell and create tight joints, so gaps would close and prevent cement paste from leaking through and being lost, creating a surface that was as watertight as wood could be, acknowledging that perfect waterproofing was impossible, but adequate waterproofing might suffice if the concrete was thick enough and the paste viscous enough and luck was generous enough. At the centre, the oculus created unique problems. The 9-meter hole couldn't be supported by centering that didn't exist in its centre, couldn't rest on timber framework that specifically had to leave that space empty, so the radial ribs converged not at a point, but at a circular compression ring made of heavy timber, multiple layers laminated together, creating a ring that would resist the enormous inward forces as all 28 ribs pressed toward the center, as the entire dome's weight tried to close the oculus, tried to collapse the framework inward, tried to demonstrate that leaving a 9-meter hole at the apex violated structural logic and would be punished by collapse unless the compression ring held, unless the timber didn't split, unless everything worked exactly as the master builder envisioned when designing this temporary structure that was itself as complex as most permanent buildings, that required as much skill and calculation and prayer as the concrete dome it was meant to support. How do you know the timber framework will hold when concrete is added and weight accumulates, and 2,000 tons press down on wood that creaks and settles and compresses under loads that make the entire structure groan like a living thing in pain? You don't know, not really, not with certainty, but you build it according to principles learned through generations of experience. You overbuild it where uncertainty demands extra strength. You inspect every joint and every connection and every piece of timber for flaws or weakness, and then you commit. You begin placing concrete. You discover whether your calculations were adequate, or whether Roman engineering has finally encountered the limit beyond which ambition cannot push, regardless of how clever the design, or how skilled the workers, or how favourable the gods. The internal scaffolding within the centering created its own complications, because workers needed access to all parts of the dome's interior surface to place concrete, needed platforms to stand on while spreading and tamping material, needed stairs or ladders to move between levels, needed all of this while the centering itself occupied most of the rotunda's interior volume, leaving limited space for the scaffolding that construction demanded. Platforms hung from the centering structure, stairs wrapped around the interior, creating circulation paths that allowed hundreds of workers to move simultaneously through the three-dimensional maze without interfering with each other, without causing bottlenecks that would slow concrete placement, without creating the delays that would allow placed concrete to begin setting before adjacent areas were poured, and the critical joints between sections wouldn't bond properly, and the dome would become a collection of separate pieces rather than a unified monolithic structure. The completion of the centering probably took a full year, 117 to 118 AD perhaps, though the dates remain conjecture, a year of carpentry that transformed the rotunda interior from an open circular space into something that resembled the interior of a wooden cathedral, the ribs rising overhead like frozen motion, the framework creating its own beauty independent of its function, reminding everyone that temporary structures can achieve magnificence even when designed only to enable other structures, even when destined for dismantling and removal and disappearance into history except as descriptions in texts that survive accidentally and photographs that won't be invented for 18 centuries. And when the centering stood complete, when the last plank was fitted and the last peg driven and the last connection inspected, the rotunda held two domes, one made of wood waiting to support one made of concrete, the temporary enabling the permanent, the visible enabling what would become visible only after the visible disappeared, creating layers of construction and time and intention that made the Pantheon not just a building, but a process, not just architecture, but the record of human determination to create what nature never suggested was possible, to build the dome that physics argued against, to crown Rome with the impossible roof that would either stand for eternity or collapse within weeks. And the only way to discover which outcome would prevail was to begin the next phase, the most dangerous phase, the phase where concrete would be poured and the centering would bear its full burden, and everyone would discover whether wood and geometry and faith could hold what stone and mathematics and gravity insisted should fall. And so the moment arrived when theory would meet concrete reality, when geometric calculations would be tested by thousands of tons of wet material pressing down on wooden centering that either would hold or wouldn't, when the dome would begin its transformation from architectural drawing to physical presence, rising layer by horizontal layer from the spring line, where walls ended and curvature began, ascending through winter and spring and summer in a process that couldn't be rushed because concrete cures at its own pace, regardless of imperial impatience or construction schedules, or the workers waiting idly for chemistry to finish its patient work before the next lift could be poured. The first lift began at the base, workers standing on scaffolding platforms inside the centering, receiving baskets of concrete that had been mixed in ground-level workshops and carried up through the rotunda's interior stairs, passed hand to hand in chains of workers who formed living conveyor systems, moving material from mixing area to placement location, each basket containing perhaps 20 or 30 kilograms of thick paste mixed with travertine aggregate, heavy concrete for the dome's base where stress would be greatest and strength most critical. Material that arrived wet and pliable and had to be spread quickly before it began the irreversible transformation from liquid to solid that Pozzolana chemistry initiated the moment water contacted lime and volcanic ash. But they weren't building a smooth dome. They were simultaneously creating a dome and carving voids into it, creating the coffers that would reduce weight without sacrificing essential strength, creating the geometric pattern of recessed squares that would march in 5 concentric rings from base to oculus, 140 coffers total, each one a depression carved into the dome's interior surface, each one reducing the concrete thickness from perhaps 1.5 meters of solid material to barely 60 centimeters at the coffer's deepest point, creating a structure that was simultaneously massive and hollow, solid and perforated, heavy and deliberately lightened in ways that seemed almost contradictory, until you understood that removing weight from where it wasn't critically needed allowed the dome to carry weight where it was critically needed, allowed the impossible to become merely difficult. The coffers were created by building formwork directly into the concrete as it was placed, wooden boxes shaped precisely to match the interior geometry of each coffer, attached to the centering surface before concrete arrived, positioned according to patterns that carpenters had marked carefully, because the coffer layout had to be perfect, had to create the visual rhythm that would make the completed dome beautiful rather than merely functional, had to decrease in size as the rings ascended toward the oculus, creating perspective effects that would make the dome appear even larger than its already impossible dimensions. How do you pour concrete around 140 wooden boxes positioned on a curved surface, while ensuring that the concrete flows properly and bonds to itself, and doesn't create voids or weak spots where water could penetrate or stress could concentrate or failure could initiate decades later, when everyone who built it is dead and nobody remembers the day these particular decisions were made? The concrete was dumped from baskets and spread with wooden tools, shovels and rakes and trowels that workers used to push the thick paste into position, working it around the coffer formwork, ensuring it filled all spaces between boxes, ensuring it made contact with the previous day's concrete, because the dome was being built in horizontal lifts and the joint between lifts had to bond perfectly, or the dome would become a stack of separate rings rather than a unified structure, would become vulnerable to delamination where one ring separated from the next, and the whole assembly came apart in layers like an onion failing from within, a catastrophe that would leave no survivors and no second chances, and no opportunity to learn from mistakes except by studying the rubble and trying to understand what went wrong. Tamping followed, spreading. Workers with long poles pounding the concrete repeatedly, driving out air bubbles that would create voids, consolidating the material so it achieved maximum density, ensuring that aggregate particles pressed against each other, creating the internal structure that would bear loads once the concrete cured, creating a process that was simultaneously violent and precise, brutal and careful, requiring strength to pound concrete into submission and sensitivity to feel when the consolidation was adequate. When continuing would be pointless or potentially damaging, when the concrete had been worked enough that adding more effort would only risk segregation, where the paste separated from the aggregate and the mixture lost its homogeneity and its strength. Each lift was perhaps 50 to 80 centimetres thick, a horizontal band that wrapped completely around the dome's circumference before the next lift could begin, creating construction that proceeded in rings rather than sections, that built the entire perimeter simultaneously rather than completing one area before moving to the next, ensuring that the dome's geometry remained true, remained circular, remained hemispherical in ways that partial construction wouldn't guarantee. And after each lift was placed and tamped and finished as smoothly as wet concrete could be finished, the waiting began. Days or weeks, depending on weather and temperature and humidity, waiting for the Pozzolana reactions to proceed far enough that the concrete gained sufficient strength to support the next lift, waiting while chemistry happened at molecular scales in processes Romans couldn't see or measure or truly understand, waiting while the structure slowly transformed from wet paste to solid pseudo-stone that would eventually be strong enough to support itself, but which currently depended entirely on the wooden centering groaning beneath it. The aggregate changed as the dome climbed, travertine at the base giving way to tufa in the middle sections, creating concrete that weighed 20% less than the base material, reducing the total mass accumulating on the centering, reducing the forces that would eventually have to be resisted by the dome's own geometry when the centering was removed, and the structure either stood or collapsed based entirely on whether the hemisphere shape could carry its own weight through pure compression without any tensile strength to help, without any of the reinforcing that modern engineers would consider essential, with nothing but properly shaped stones pressing against each other in patterns that Romans understood intuitively, even if they couldn't calculate them mathematically. And higher still, approaching the oculus where the dome curved steeply and where every kilogram mattered maximally, the aggregate became pumice, volcanic foam so light it seemed almost to mock the concept of stone, pieces that floated when dropped in water, material that created concrete weighing 30% less than the base, creating a dome that literally became less dense as it climbed, that defied what stone should be, that transformed from earthbound heaviness at the bottom to something approaching lightness at the top, creating graduated density that made the impossible slightly less impossible, though still sufficiently impossible that everyone involved must have harboured doubts about whether this would work, whether the dome would stand, whether Roman engineering had finally reached too far. The coffers complicated everything, because as each lift was poured, workers had to place concrete carefully around the wooden formwork boxes that created the voids, had to ensure concrete flowed beneath the boxes and around their sides, had to prevent voids from forming in hard-to-reach areas where concrete couldn't easily flow, had to work by feel as much as by sight, because much of the work happened in shadow, in tight spaces, in areas where you couldn't see what you were doing and had to trust that experience and technique would produce adequate results even when verification was impossible. How do you build 140 perfectly shaped square holes into a curved dome while simultaneously pouring thousands of tons of concrete around them, when mistakes are invisible until after the centering is removed, and by then it's too late to fix anything except by tearing everything down and starting over, which nobody wants and nobody could afford, and which would mean admitting failure on the most public project in Rome? The ribs between coffers became the primary load-bearing structure. Concrete that flowed into the spaces between wooden boxes created ridges, structural elements that would carry most of the dome's weight, that would channel forces downward toward the walls, that would make the coffers not just decorative but essential, not just weight-saving but structurally necessary, transforming what could have been merely aesthetic choice into engineering genius, where form and function unified completely, where you couldn't separate what made the dome beautiful from what made the dome possible because they were the same things, the same geometric decisions, the same pattern of presence and absence, solid and void, weight and weightlessness balanced in proportions that created both strength and grace. The work continued through seasons: winter, when cold slowed; curing but also reduced the risk of concrete drying too quickly; spring, when temperatures moderated and work proceeded smoothly; summer, when heat threatened to bake the concrete before it fully hydrated, and workers threw wet cloths over freshly placed material to keep moisture from evaporating too rapidly; autumn, when everyone pushed to complete as much as possible before winter returned and construction became difficult again. Years passed. 119, 120, 121, perhaps into 122, each year adding meters of height, each season contributing lifts that brought the dome closer to the oculus, that remained always ahead, always waiting, always demanding attention, because the oculus was simultaneously the goal and the greatest structural challenge, the point where all the dome's geometry converged, and where the compression ring would have to hold against forces trying to collapse the opening, trying to close the 9-meter hole, trying to demonstrate that deliberately weakening the apex was folly. And finally, after years of lifts and waiting and curing and hoping, the dome approached completion, the pumice aggregate creating concrete so light it seemed almost fragile, the steep curve near the oculus making placement difficult because gravity wanted to pull everything downward, but the surface was nearly vertical, the final ring of coffers giving way to the compression ring itself, that critical circle of brick and concrete that would frame the oculus, that would bear the converging thrust from all the ribs, that would either hold everything together or fail and initiate collapse that would unzip the entire dome in seconds, that would prove Roman engineering either prescient or delusional, either genius or hubris, either worthy of the gods whose temple this was or contemptuous of the physical laws those gods presumably established when they created the universe. Romans were trying so hard to understand and master and somehow transcend through nothing but volcanic ash and lime paste, and the stubborn insistence that humans could build what nature never suggested was possible. The last concrete was placed. The oculus stood complete. The dome rose, finished above the centering that still supported it entirely, and the waiting began again. Longer waiting this time, conservative waiting, letting the concrete cure not just weeks but months, letting the pozzolana chemistry proceed to completion, letting the structure gain its full strength before attempting the most terrifying phase, the phase where wooden supports would be removed and everyone would discover whether the impossible dome could hold itself or whether 43 meters of concrete would collapse into rubble and take with it all the years and hopes and labor that had created it. And so the dome stood complete, its concrete cured through months of patient waiting, its coffers carved into geometric patterns that would remain hidden until the centering descended, its 2,000 tons of material resting entirely on wooden framework that had been groaning under the weight for so long that the creaking had become normal, had become background sound that workers no longer noticed consciously, but which haunted their dreams with the suggestion that timber had limits, and those limits were being tested daily, hourly, constantly, by forces that never rested and never diminished, and never forgave the slightest weakness in material or joinery or the calculations that had determined how much wood would be enough to hold what no wood had ever been asked to hold before. The decision to begin removal must have required courage bordering on recklessness, because there was no way to test whether the concrete had gained sufficient strength, no way to verify that the dome could support itself, no precedent at this scale to provide confidence, nothing but intuition and faith, and the awareness that waiting longer only delayed the inevitable moment when wooden supports would have to descend, and the structure would either stand or fall, based entirely on whether Roman geometry and concrete chemistry, and the graduated density from heavy base to light apex, had created a dome that could survive in pure compression without the tensile strength that stone fundamentally lacked and that concrete shared with stone in lacking. How do you decide when concrete has cured enough to support itself when removing the supports too early means 2,000 tons collapse onto everyone inside, and removing them too late means wasting months of expensive delay? There were signs, probably. The concrete had hardened beyond what fingernails could scratch. The surface rang rather than thudded when struck with hammers. The shrinkage cracks that appeared during initial curing had stopped propagating. The seasonal cycle of summer heat and winter cold had passed without the structure showing distress. But signs weren't certainty, weren't guarantees, weren't promises that the dome would behave as theory predicted rather than as physics might prefer. If physics decided that 43-meter concrete domes violated principles that shouldn't be violated regardless of how carefully humans built them. The removal strategy relied on wedges, wooden wedges that had been positioned months earlier under the centering support posts, driven into place when the centering was built, creating adjustment mechanisms that could be operated from below, that would allow the entire framework to be lowered gradually rather than dropped suddenly, that would give the dome time to adjust to supporting itself rather than forcing instant transition from fully supported to entirely self-supporting, which seemed like a recipe for catastrophic failure, for cracks propagating faster than eyes could follow, for the horrible sound of stone breaking that would precede by seconds the collapse that would kill everyone who hadn't already fled. The master builder, whose name history hasn't preserved though his work survives, probably selected the first wedges to be removed with care bordering on obsession, probably chose edge locations where stress was lowest, where the dome was thickest, where failure seemed least likely, where if something went wrong it might reveal itself gradually rather than catastrophically, might provide warning rather than simply ending everything in rubble and recrimination. Workers approached with hammers, positioned themselves near the selected wedges, and at some signal, a shout perhaps, or a hand gesture, or simply the master builder's nod, began driving the wedges outward, freeing them from the positions they had occupied for years, allowing the centering to settle slightly, perhaps a centimetre or two, enough that gaps opened between the wooden surface and the concrete above it, enough that the dome began, just barely began, to carry its own weight. Everyone watched the walls, because if the dome's outward thrust exceeded what the rotunda walls could resist, those walls would spread at their base, would move outward visibly, would crack in patterns that indicated structural failure was imminent or already underway, would signal that the dome was too heavy, or the walls too weak, or the geometry inadequate despite all the calculations and prayers and careful construction that had gone into creating this moment. But the walls held, stood firm, showed no visible movement, though surely they settled microscopically, compressed slightly under the new loads being transferred to them, adjusted in ways too small to see but real nonetheless, demonstrable by instruments Romans didn't possess but which modern engineers could verify if they could somehow travel back to 124 AD and witness this moment when the impossible became actual, or revealed itself as merely impossible after all. The sounds were probably terrifying. Concrete adjusting to new stress patterns, mortar joints accommodating differential movement, the dome settling onto itself, creating noises that echoed in the rotunda's vast interior space, sounds that could be interpreted as normal adjustment or as incipient failure, depending on your optimism or paranoia, sounds that made workers freeze and listen and try to determine whether that particular crack meant nothing or meant everything, whether they should continue or flee or simply wait to see if the next sound was the beginning of collapse that would give them perhaps 3 seconds to understand their mistake before the ceiling fell. Day by day the removal proceeded. A few more wedges hammered out, the centering settling another increment, gaps widening between wood and concrete, the dome progressively supporting more of its own weight, while the centering progressively supported less, creating a gradual transition that took weeks, or possibly months, that tested patience as severely as it tested engineering, that demanded faith that slow, careful work would succeed where hasty work would certainly fail, that required trusting process over anxiety, trusting geometry over fear, trusting that the dome wanted to stand even if physics suggested it shouldn't. Workers dismantled sections of centering as they were freed from load, removing planks, disconnecting ring beams, lowering radial ribs in pieces, salvaging expensive timber that could be reused on other projects, creating the practical imperative to continue removal, even when terror might have suggested stopping, waiting longer, giving the concrete more time, even though more time wouldn't make the concrete stronger than it already was, would only postpone discovery of whether the structure would stand or fall, would only extend the anxiety without reducing the risk that the answer would be collapse rather than triumph. What runs through your mind as you hammer out the final wedges and hear the last creaking as the centering settles, one final centimetre, and the dome begins carrying its full weight entirely through its own geometry? The workers probably prayed to every god the Pantheon was meant to honour, Jupiter and Mars and Venus and Minerva and all the others whose statues would eventually fill the alcoves, whose temple this was, whose favour might mean the difference between the dome that stands and the dome that falls, whose intervention might be the margin between success and failure, if the margin was measured in millimetres or megapascals, or the tiny variations that separate adequate from inadequate, in structures built at the absolute edge of what materials and geometry could achieve, and then silence. Not empty silence, but the profound stillness that follows when expected. Catastrophe doesn't arrive. When the dome holds, when concrete compresses under its own weight but doesn't crack beyond the hairline fissures that were normal and expected and acceptable. when the walls remain vertical, when the oculus compression ring bears its enormous load without failing, when everything that theory predicted actually happens in reality despite the 1,000 ways it could have gone wrong, despite the uncertainty that preceded this moment, despite the awareness that dome failures in Roman construction were not unknown, and that this dome was larger than any that had successfully stood before. The centering came to rest on the floor, completely separated from the dome above it, no longer bearing any weight, no longer serving any structural function, simply occupying space that would need to be cleared before the Pantheon could be completed, before the interior could be finished with marble facing and floor patterns and all the decorative elements that would transform engineering achievement into architectural masterpiece. Workers began dismantling the framework systematically, carrying timber out through the entrance, loading it onto carts, removing the wooden ghost that had made the concrete reality possible, erasing evidence of the temporary structure that had enabled the permanent one, creating the paradox where the thing that made the dome possible disappeared entirely and left behind only the dome itself as if it had always existed, as if it had required no support during construction, as if Roman engineering simply commanded concrete to span 43 meters, and concrete obeyed because concrete recognized Roman authority. The first rain through the oculus must have been momentous. Water falling from sky through the 9-meter hole, drops descending 22 meters from roof apex to floor, splashing onto marble that would eventually be installed, but which was currently rough concrete, water spreading slightly before finding the drainage grates, 22 bronze grills set into the floor in a circle around the centre point, and disappearing into the Roman drainage system that would carry it away to sewers that would ultimately deliver it to the Tiber River, where it would join the flow moving toward the sea, completing the water cycle that the oculus acknowledged, that the dome participated in, that made the Pantheon simultaneously shelter and exposure, simultaneously protected space and space open to weather, simultaneously indoor and outdoor in ways that conventional architecture refused, but which the Pantheon embraced as essential to its identity. How do you feel standing in the completed dome the day after the centering is removed, looking up at concrete that curves overhead in a perfect hemisphere, seeing for the first time the coffers that had been hidden behind wooden formwork, seeing the oculus framing sky in a circle that seems impossibly large yet somehow exactly right, seeing the achievement that took years to build finally revealed in its completed form. The workers probably felt relief, more than triumph initially. Relief that they'd survived, that the structure stood, that their names wouldn't be associated with Rome's most spectacular construction failure, that they could move forward to finishing work rather than backward to explaining what went wrong and why the impossible had proven actually impossible rather than merely improbable. But beneath the relief must have been something else. The awareness that they'd built something unprecedented, something that would outlast them by centuries or possibly millennia, something that demonstrated human capability at scales that justified the hubris of attempting it in the first place, something that made the years of labour and the moments of terror and the constant uncertainty worthwhile because the dome stood, impossibly stood, would stand through that day and the next day and the day after that, and through years that stretched ahead into futures none of them would see, but which their dome would witness, would shelter, would crown with Roman engineering genius that needed no signature, because the work itself testified to the builder's skill more eloquently than any inscription could, more permanently than any record, more triumphantly than any words. The dome held through the first day and the first week and the first year, held through Roman Empire and Byzantine Empire and Papal States, and Italian Kingdom and Italian Republic, held through 19 centuries of weather and war and neglect and restoration, held because geometry worked, because concrete cured properly, because graduated density succeeded, because the oculus paradoxically strengthened rather than weakened, because Roman builders understood intuitively what engineers wouldn't calculate mathematically for another 1800 years, because sometimes the impossible is simply a description of what nobody has achieved yet rather than what nobody can achieve ever, because the Pantheon stands. And so the dome stood self-supporting at last, concrete holding itself through geometry alone, but a dome without weatherproofing and walls without decoration, and a temple without its entrance, portico remained incomplete, remained impressive engineering waiting to become complete architecture, remained structure waiting to become building, and the work that lay ahead, though less death-defying than building the dome itself, would determine whether the Pantheon became merely functional or transcended function entirely, and became the architectural masterpiece that would still be studied 2,000 years later by civilizations that built with steel and computers, yet looked back at Roman concrete with something approaching awe. The exterior dome needed roofing. The concrete surface, though solid and waterproof enough in itself, would benefit from protective covering that would shed rain before it contacted the porous concrete, would prevent freeze-thaw cycles from gradually degrading the surface, would add another barrier between weather and structure. The Romans chose bronze tiles, thousands of individual plates perhaps a metre square, each one cast from bronze that arrived at the site after being mined somewhere in the empire's vast territories, smelted, refined, cast into sheets, trimmed to size, transported to Rome through supply chains that stretched across seas and mountains, and represented logistics as complex as the construction itself. Installing bronze tiles on a curved surface 60 metres above ground required scaffolding that wrapped the dome's exterior. Wooden frameworks erected with the same care that had gone into the centering, creating platforms where workers could stand while positioning tiles, overlapping them like scales moving from bottom to top, each tile secured to the concrete beneath with bronze nails or clamps, each joint sealed to prevent water infiltration, the entire surface gradually transforming from rough concrete grey to gleaming bronze that would catch sunlight and announce the Pantheon's presence across Rome's rooftops, that would age over decades into the green patina that bronze develops when exposed to weather, but which initially must have glowed, almost golden, almost alive, almost too brilliant to look at directly when afternoon sun struck it at the right angle. But the bronze roof, impressive as it was, expensive as it certainly was, represented perhaps the least ambitious element of the finishing work compared to what stood waiting at the Pantheon's northern face. The portico, that rectangular entrance porch that would transform the rotunda's perfect circle into something more complex, more layered, more traditionally temple-like, with its columns and pediment, and the inscription that even now, 2,000 years later, announces that Marcus Agrippa built this place, though Hadrian actually rebuilt it entirely and generously credited his predecessor rather than claiming sole glory for himself, creating historical confusion that persists across millennia, but also demonstrating political grace that emperors didn't always exhibit. The portico required 16 granite columns. Not limestone or marble, but granite. Grey stone quarried in Egypt at Mons Claudianus. Each column a single piece of stone 12 metres tall and 1.5 metres in diameter, each one weighing approximately 60 tons, more than 10 elephants, more than most buildings' entire stone budget, and all 16 had to be transported from Egyptian desert to Roman construction site across distances measured in thousands of kilometers, across seas that could sink ships carrying irreplaceable cargo, across terrain that made moving 60-ton objects without modern equipment seem less like construction challenge and more like deliberate impossibility designed to test whether humans really wanted this temple badly enough to justify the expense and effort and sheer stubborn determination required. The columns travelled by ship, loaded somehow onto vessels built specifically for heavy cargo, probably laid horizontally on reinforced decks, probably requiring multiple ships because placing several 60-ton columns on a single vessel would risk capsizing or simply exceeding what ancient hull construction could bear, sailing across the Mediterranean from Alexandria to Ostia, Rome's port, where they would be transferred to river barges for the journey up the Tiber, then finally rolled overland the remaining distance to the Campus Martius, where the Pantheon waited for its entrance porch, where workers waited to attempt lifting operations that would make the dome construction seem almost simple by comparison, because at least concrete could be placed in small increments, but granite columns arrived as finished monoliths that had to be raised vertical without breaking, without dropping, without killing the workers operating the cranes and ropes that constituted Roman heavy lifting technology. How do you lift 60 tons vertically when your cranes are powered by humans walking inside wooden wheels? When your ropes are made from plant fibers that break under excessive load? When failure means watching irreplaceable granite crash onto stone pavement and shatter into pieces that took Egyptian quarrymen months to extract and shape? The operation probably used multiple cranes working together, probably involved temporary earthen ramps allowing partial lifting followed by blocking and repositioning, probably consumed weeks per column, probably featured moments where ropes creaked ominously, and foremen shouted warnings, and workers scattered in case the load fell, and survival depended on being somewhere else when 60 tons of granite contacted ground at terminal velocity. Each column had to be positioned precisely on its base, had to stand perfectly vertical despite being 12 meters tall and inherently unstable, had to be secured somehow until the entablature above locked everything together, creating the moment when structural interdependence began and individual columns became part of a unified portico that was stronger than the sum of its parts, but which couldn't achieve that strength until all parts were positioned and connected, and the last element was set, and suddenly the structure that had seemed perpetually on the verge of collapsing became stable, became permanent, became architecture rather than construction, became foreground for the rotunda behind it, rather than simply being 16 columns standing in rows wondering what came next. The capitals crowning each column, Corinthian capitals with their elaborate acanthus leaf carvings, were carved from marble rather than granite, were lighter and more workable, and could be shaped into the decorative complexity that Corinthian order demanded. Capitals that had to be lifted onto column tops and secured with metal dowels set in lead, creating connections that would hold for centuries, that would survive earthquakes and storms and the slow settling that all buildings experience as foundations compress microscopically and materials adjust to loads and the structure finds its equilibrium between the forces trying to stand it up and the forces trying to pull it down. Above the columns, the entablature and pediment completed the portico, horizontal beams spanning between column capitals, creating the triangular gabled end that classical temple architecture demanded, space that originally held sculptural reliefs, whose subjects have been lost to time but which certainly depicted gods or emperors, or mythological scenes appropriate to a temple dedicated to all deities. Bronze letters spelling Agrippa's name across the architrave in an inscription that would become one of history's most famous misleading attributions, creating the assumption that survived until modern archaeology proved otherwise, that sometimes the name on the building doesn't match the person who actually built it, but historical convention preserves the earlier attribution regardless. The interior walls received marble facing, coloured stones from across the empire, porphyry from Egypt displaying its imperial purple, giallo antico from Tunisia, glowing golden pavonazzetto from Turkey showing white streaked with purple veins, cipollino from Greece with its distinctive green waviness, all cut into panels and attached to the concrete rotunda walls with metal clamps and mortar, creating surfaces that transform the rough brick-faced walls into polished elegance, creating visual richness that matched the architectural sophistication, creating interior space that felt simultaneously massive and intimate, simultaneously austere and decorated, simultaneously simple in its geometry and complex in its details. The floor became a geometric masterpiece, circular and square patterns nested within each other, different coloured marbles creating contrasts and rhythms, the entire surface sloping almost imperceptibly toward the centre, where water entering through the oculus would collect and drain through those 22 bronze grates set into the floor, disappearing into channels that connected to Rome's sewer system, completing the water cycle that the oculus initiated, making the building simultaneously shelter and weather, simultaneously protection and exposure, simultaneously conventional temple and radical reimagining of what temples could be if freed from the requirement that roofs be solid and complete and impermeable to sky. The bronze doors, 12 meters tall, among the largest ancient doors surviving into the modern era, were installed in the main entrance, each door leaf cast in sections and assembled, hinges engineered to bear multiple tons of bronze while allowing the doors to swing smoothly, creating the threshold between exterior and interior, between secular city and sacred space, between Rome as it was and Rome as it aspired to be, between human scale and divine scale, between the ordinary and the impossible made ordinary through accomplishment. And finally, sometime around 125 AD, 12 years after construction began, 12 years of excavation and foundation and walls and centering and dome and finishing work, the Pantheon stood complete, or as complete as buildings ever truly are, because maintenance would continue forever. Repairs would be needed constantly. Modifications would be made by subsequent generations who had their own ideas about what the temple should be or could become. But the essential structure was finished. The impossible dome crowned the rotunda, the oculus-framed sky, the bronze roof gleamed in sunlight, the portico announced entrance, the marble interior glowed in the coloured light that filtered through the opening 43 metres overhead, and Rome had its temple to all gods, its architectural masterpiece, its engineering triumph that would outlast the empire that built it, that would survive into futures that couldn't be imagined by anyone standing in the completed structure that day, when the dedication ceremonies finally happened, and Hadrian walked through those bronze doors and looked up at the dome he'd commissioned, and saw that it held, impossibly held, permanently held, proof that Roman engineering could build what physics suggested shouldn't be built, could create what geometry promised might be possible, if only the concrete was strong enough, and the calculations accurate enough, and the courage sufficient to attempt what had never been attempted before, and might never be attempted again at such scale, until modern materials made it easier, made it safer, made it less impressive somehow. because the difficulty was part of the achievement, and removing the difficulty removes some of the glory that comes from doing what seems impossible. With nothing but volcanic ash and lime and human determination to create structures that outlast empires and civilizations and languages and everything, except the stones themselves pressing against each other in compression that has continued for 1900 years and shows no sign of stopping, shows no sign of failure, shows only the patient endurance of concrete that wanted to stand, and was given the opportunity to prove that sometimes impossibility is simply another word for what nobody has done yet rather than what nobody can do ever. Evening settles over Rome, and the last visitors depart through bronze doors that close with a sound that echoes briefly before being absorbed into the vast circular space, into the hemisphere overhead that has heard this sound thousands of times, millions of times perhaps, across 19 centuries of openings and closings, welcomings and farewells, the rhythm of human presence and absence that buildings experience as their version of breathing, their version of life. The interior darkens slowly, not suddenly, not completely, because the oculus admits whatever light the sky offers, and tonight the sky offers stars emerging one by one through the 9-meter circle that frames them perfectly, that presents the cosmos as if through a lens, as if the dome itself is a viewing device designed to make infinity comprehensible by limiting it to a manageable circle, by reducing the overwhelming vastness of space to a portion that human minds can contemplate without vertigo. Stand at the center, looking up. The coffers recede overhead in 5 concentric rings, their geometric pattern pulling the eye upward toward the oculus, toward the opening that reveals darkness now, darkness scattered with light, the same stars that Romans saw when the Pantheon was new, the same constellations that guided sailors and marked seasons and inspired myths about gods who supposedly lived somewhere beyond the atmosphere, somewhere in the perfection that geometry approached but never quite achieved, except perhaps here, perhaps in this hemisphere that curves with mathematical precision, invisible to eyes but felt somehow, sensed in the rightness of the proportions, in the balance between diameter and height, that creates space shaped like half a sphere, waiting to be completed by imagination. The marble floor is cool underfoot, polished stone that holds the day's warmth and releases it slowly into the night air that flows through the oculus, creating gentle circulation, creating movement too subtle to feel directly but present nonetheless in the way dust motes drift, in the way sound behaves differently here than in rectangular rooms, in the way the space feels alive even when empty, feels occupied even when abandoned, feels like it's waiting rather than resting, waiting for tomorrow's visitors, waiting for morning light that will track across the interior in patterns determined by sun and season, and the rotation that makes days from darkness and darkness from days. Listen to the silence. Not empty silence, but full silence. Silence that contains the building's history, that holds echoes of prayers spoken in Latin and Greek and Italian across centuries, that remembers footsteps of emperors and popes and pilgrims and tourists, that knows the sound of rain falling through the oculus more intimately than any other building knows rain, because most buildings exclude weather, while the Pantheon admits it, welcomes it, incorporates it into the experience of interior space that isn't quite interior, because the sky is always visible, always present, always reminding occupants that walls and roofs create shelter, but can't create separation from the cosmos, can't isolate humans from the universe they inhabit, however much they might try. The compression never stops, stone pressing stone with forces measured in megatons, concrete bearing its own weight through geometry alone, the dome holding itself through the same principles that held it the day the centering was removed, through the same physics that will hold it tomorrow and next year and next century if maintenance continues, if repairs address the small failures before they become large failures. If humans remain interested in preserving what other humans built so long ago that the original purposes have been replaced by new purposes, the temple to all gods having become a church, the church having become a monument, the monument having become simply itself, simply the Pantheon, simply the oldest continuously used building with a major dome in the world, simply architecture that transcends its origins and becomes permanent. Moonlight enters through the oculus now, a silver beam that strikes the floor and creates a pool of pale illumination, a spotlight that will move across the interior as the moon crosses the sky, as Earth rotates beneath celestial bodies that appear to move but which are actually standing still while we move, while the planet spins, while the hemisphere above watches with the patience of stone that has no reason to hurry, no appointments to keep, no urgency except the slow pressure of compression that will continue as long as the structure stands. Lie down on the floor at the center, look straight up through the oculus, through the 9-meter hole that shouldn't make the dome stronger but does, that shouldn't work but has worked for 1900 years, that represents the paradox at the heart of the Pantheon, where removing material created strength, where opening the roof improved it, where the hole became the solution rather than the problem, where conventional wisdom proved wrong and radical innovation proved correct. And the building stands as permanent testimony to the value of attempting what seems impossible, because sometimes the impossible is simply possible in ways nobody has discovered yet. Your breathing slows, matches the rhythm of the space somehow, matches the patient endurance of concrete that doesn't breathe but persists, that doesn't live but survives, that isn't conscious but witnesses everything, that has seen more human history than any person could see, that has outlasted empires and religions and languages and architectural styles, that has simply continued being itself while everything around it transformed, while Rome fell and rose again in different forms, while the world changed in ways that would seem like magic to the Romans who built this place, but which are simply time doing what time does, which is making the present into the past and the future into the present in cycles that buildings experience more slowly than humans, but experience nonetheless. The stars wheel overhead, appearing to rotate though they remain fixed and we rotate, creating the illusion of motion that makes sky seem active when it's actually our motion. We're seeing our spin, our orbit, our movement through space that continues whether we notice it or not, whether we're awake or asleep, whether we're aware or dreaming, whether we're here in the Pantheon or somewhere else entirely, because the universe doesn't require our attention to continue functioning, doesn't need us to understand it to continue existing, simply is, simply persists, simply presses forward into futures that we imagine but can't control, that we influence but don't command, that arrive regardless of our plans in the same way that tomorrow will arrive whether we sleep or not, but sleep makes arrival easier, makes transition smoother, makes the boundary between today and tomorrow less abrupt, less jarring, less noticeable. Let the dome hold you. Not physically, not literally, but somehow, in the way that geometry can feel protective, in the way that perfect proportions create comfort, in the way that compression continuing for centuries without failure creates confidence that it will continue tonight, that the hemisphere won't suddenly decide after 1900 years to collapse, that the oculus will remain open, that the structure will persist through your sleep, and be waiting when you wake, if you wake here, if you wake at all, if waking matters when sleep is this deep, this peaceful, this complete. The Pantheon sleeps with you, in its way, in the way that stone sleeps, in the way that concrete dreams, in the way that compression rests without resting, in the way that impossible domes prove themselves possible night after night, century after century, compressing and holding and standing and witnessing and simply being what they are, what they were built to be, what they will continue being long after tonight becomes memory, becomes history, becomes the distant past that future visitors will study while standing in the same space, looking up at the same oculus, seeing different stars perhaps, but seeing them through the same circle, through the same opening, through the same hole in the roof that makes everything stronger, that makes everything possible, that makes everything sleep.